You have 30 seconds left inside the boat. The air smells of diesel fuel, salt water, and the vomit of 36 men who have spent 2 hours flat-bottomed on the choppy waters of the English Channel. The craft you are standing in is called a landing craft, vehicle, personnel, or simply a Higgins boat. It is made of plywood and a single sheet of 3-ply steel on the front ramp. It was designed to carry timber in the bayous of Louisiana. It was not designed to stop a German 7.92mm round. The steel ramp in front of you is cold. If you touch it, your hand leaves a smear of sweat that turns gray in the damp salt air. In your left breast pocket, behind a piece of water-resistant oilcloth, is a photograph of your family. On your back is 68 pounds of wet wool and steel. The ramp drops. The math starts. You do not step onto the sand. The coxswain of the Higgins boat has hit a sandbar 300 yards from the shoreline of Omaha Beach, designated as Sector Easy Red. The water in front of the ramp is 5 feet deep. When you take your first step forward, the weight of your equipment is the first thing that tries to kill you. The Army issued you an M1 Garand rifle wrapped in a protective condom, 96 rounds of ammunition in cotton bandoliers, 2 hand grenades, a steel helmet, a small shovel, and 3 days of K rations. They also made you wear a chemical detection brassard on your left shoulder, a paper sleeve treated with a chemical indicator designed to turn pink if the enemy uses mustard gas. The paper is already soggy. It does not change color. It simply tears. The weight of the wet wool uniform alone is 12 pounds. When soaked in seawater, it doubles in weight. If you slip into a channel of water that is deeper than your height, the 68 pounds on your back acts as an anchor. Many of the men who left the boat beside you do not make it to the shallow water. They do not get shot. They drown in the first 10 yards because they cannot release the quick-release strap on their assault jackets with fingers that are numb from the 54-degree water. The water around your knees is thick with sand and the gray exhaust of the landing craft. The pocket is small. The weight is large. You walk through the surf. The resistance of the water makes every step feel like you are moving through wet cement. You do not run. You cannot run. The physical reality of D-Day is not a sprint across the sand. It is a slow, halting crawl against gravity and physics. The German gunners on the bluff at Widerstands Nest 62, located 170 feet above the beach, are firing MG-42 machine guns. The weapon fires at a rate of 25 rounds per second. The sound does not report as individual shots. It is a continuous tearing noise, like the ripping of heavy canvas. The bullets do not hit the water randomly. They are directed at the sandbar, pre-registered to the exact coordinates where the flat-bottom boats must stop. You reach the wet assembly area, the narrow strip of wet sand where the tide is beginning to turn. The beach is covered with obstacles. There are large structures made of angled iron called hedgehogs, and wooden posts tipped with teller mines pointing toward the sea, and heavy steel frames known as Belgian gates. You have been trained to use these obstacles for cover. This is the second mistake. The obstacles are not cover. They are targets. The German artillery crews in the Bluffs have spent 3 months calibrating their 88mm guns to the exact position of every Belgian gate on the beach. If you stand behind a hedgehog for more than 10 seconds, you are standing in a pre-sighted kill zone. The iron frame does not stop shrapnel. It generates it. When an artillery round hits the metal, the iron breaks into jagged, high-velocity shards that are more lethal than the shell itself. The ramp drops. The math starts. You move forward because staying still is a mathematical certainty of death. You crawl past a soldier who is sitting upright in the wet sand, his hands resting on his lap as if he is waiting for a bus. He has no visible wounds, but his eyes are fixed on the horizon, and he does not blink when the sand kicked up by a mortar blast covers his face. The military calls this combat exhaustion. The men call it the stare. Your boots are full of sand and small shells that cut into your skin through your wool socks. The pain is specific and small, a distraction from the larger physical reality of the Bluffs. The Bluffs are not dirt. They are a network of reinforced concrete bunkers connected by deep trenches. The concrete is 4 feet thick. It was poured by French forced laborers under the direction of the organization Taut. The guns inside the bunkers have a field of fire that sweeps the entire beach from east to west. They do not need to look at you. They only need to fire along the pre-established lanes. The lane you are in is currently occupied by the remnants of 3 different companies. The plan you memorized on the transport ship, the map showing the specific exit lanes, the assembly points, and the timetables, is gone. The officers who held the maps are dead. The landing craft were drifted off course by a strong lateral current of 3 knots, landing your unit 1,000 yards to the east of your target sector. You do not know the names of the men crawling beside you. They do not know yours. The unit is not a tactical organization anymore.
Keep your heads down.
It is a collection of individuals trying to reach the shingle. The shingle is a bank of smooth gray stones that sits at the high water mark. It is 3 feet high and offers the first real cover from flat trajectory machine gun fire. You throw your body over the stones. The impact knocks the wind from your lungs. The stones are cold and smell of oil and wet kelp. You lie flat. The bullets pass 2 inches above your helmet. The sound is a sharp crack as they break the sound barrier. Beside you is a combat engineer named Miller. He is carrying 2 tetritol demolition charges in a canvas bag. His hands are covered in grease and sand. He has no rifle. His mission was to clear a path through the double-apron barbed wire fence that sits behind the shingle. But the detonators were lost when his assistant drowned during the landing. "We don't have the cord," Miller says. His voice is quiet, almost conversational, because the volume of the noise around you has reached a level where your ears cannot process it as sound anymore. It is a physical pressure that vibrates in your jaw. He uses his fingers to dig a trench in the gravel to lower his profile. He does this methodically, moving 3 stones at a time. The pocket is small. The weight is large. To your left, a lieutenant you do not recognize is trying to assemble a radio transmitter. The device is a BC-611, a handheld unit that is supposed to connect the beach to the command ship USS Ancon. The antenna is extended, but the speaker only emits a steady hiss of static.
Acknowledged. Moving.
The water has entered the battery compartment, corroding the contacts in under 10 minutes. The lieutenant does not look angry. He simply repeats the call sign, Easy Red, into the microphone over and over, his voice flat and rhythmic, like a priest reciting a liturgy. The system that was supposed to coordinate the invasion, the bombers that were supposed to crater the beach, the naval guns that were supposed to silence the bunkers, has failed. The bombers dropped their payloads 3 miles inland because the cloud cover was too thick, and the pilots feared hitting their own men. The naval shells landed in the deep water, creating huge waterspouts that did nothing to the concrete bunkers on the bluffs. You are not part of a grand machine. You are the leftover margin of error. The lieutenant stops speaking. A piece of shrapnel from a mortar shell has cut the antenna of his radio. He looks at the broken metal, then slides the radio into the sand. He does not pull it back. The sun is beginning to break through the gray cloud cover. The light is pale and cold. It illuminates the beach behind you. The water is rising. The tide is pushing the landing craft, the wreckage of trucks, the floating equipment, and the bodies of the first wave against the shingle. The ramp drops. The math starts. You must cross the wire. If you remain behind the shingle, the tide will pin you against the stones, and the German mortars will find your coordinates. The mortars fire in 4 shell salvos. They are called 8cm Granatwerfer 34. The flight of the shell takes 14 seconds. You can hear the whistle as it descends, a sound that starts high and slides down the scale until it ends in a dull thump that shakes the stones beneath your ribs. Miller crawls to the wire. He does not have a demolition charge. He has a pair of wire cutters. He cuts the first strand of the concertina wire. The metal is thick and galvanized. It makes a sharp snap when the blades close. He moves slowly, his elbows tucked into his sides to avoid the machine gun fire that is sweeping the sand 2 inches above him. A bullet hits his shoulder. The impact rotates his body. He does not scream. He simply drops the cutters and presses his hand against the wound, his fingers turning dark red as the blood mixes with the wet wool of his jacket. He looks at you. His eyes are clear. "Take the cutters," he says. "You do not think about the choice. If you think about the choice, you think about the photograph in your pocket and the 30 seconds inside the boat and the distance between the easy red sector and the porch of the house where you sat when you were 19. That distance is too large to process. You crawl forward. You pick up the wire cutters. The steel handle is greasy with Miller's blood. You cut the next strand, then the next. The wire catches on your sleeve, tearing the paper gas brassard from your shoulder. The pink chemical indicator does not show gas. It shows the blood from your own arm where the barb cut the skin. The gap is small. The wire is heavy. You crawl through the hole. The sand behind the wire is not sand. It is a minefield designated as Minenfeld 3. The Germans have planted S-mines, known to the soldiers as bouncing Bettys. The mine is a small steel canister containing 360 steel balls. When stepped on, a small black prong triggers a propellant charge that shoots the canister 3 feet into the air before detonating. The detonation is designed to kill at waist height. You must walk where the ground has already been disturbed. You look for the footprints of the men who went before you, or the tracks left by the tank that crawled 20 yards before a shell hit its tread. The tank is now a burning shell of steel, the smoke from its engine compartment black and thick, smelling of grease and burnt oil. You reach the base of the bluff. The slope is 60 degrees. The dirt is dry and slides away under your boots. To climb, you must pull yourself up by the roots of the sparse grass that grows in the clay. The grass is dry and sharp. It cuts your palms. Above you, on the crest of the hill, are the Rangers of the 2nd Battalion. They did not land at Easy Red. They landed at Pointe du Hoc, 3 miles to the west, and have fought their way along the cliffs. They are using rocket-propelled grappling hooks to scale the vertical rock face. The ropes are wet and heavy. The hooks are anchored in the clay at the top of the cliff. You see a rope hanging down the clay bank. It is made of 3-inch hemp. It is slippery with wet mud. You grab the rope. Your hands are raw. The weight of your 68 pounds of gear pulls your shoulders down, but you pull. You move 1 foot up, then the next. The ramp drops. The math starts. You reach the top of the bluff. The view from the crest is wide. You can see the entire English Channel, the hundreds of ships sitting 3 miles out, the landing craft moving in small circles in the gray water, the smoke rising from the burning landing craft, and the long, thin line of easy red sector where the tide is now covering the sand. The bluffs are quiet. The concrete bunkers are silent because the Rangers have entered the trenches from the rear. The German soldiers who fired the machine guns are gone or dead. You sit in a trench that is 3 feet deep, lined with wooden planks. The dirt is cool. You reach into your pocket. You pull out the oilcloth package. The photograph is dry. The faces of your family look out at you from the black and white print. They look the same as they did when you put the photo in your pocket on the transport ship. You look at your hands. The skin is gray, covered in dirt, blood, and salt. You are not a hero. You are the survivor of a calculation you did not make. The system did not protect you. The system did not guide you. It simply threw enough weight at the beach until the beach could not hold the weight anymore. The pocket is small. The weight is large. The clock on the wall does not tick. It simply changes. If this one stayed with you, share it. Subscribe if you are new here. Every week, this channel goes somewhere most people never look.